What is going on, everybody? It is the Stokastic MLB Strategy Show. We got a whole bunch of games to break down, and none of them really featuring good pitchers. Last night, though, we did have what seemed like good pitchers, and then almost all of them sucked other than Julio Urias. So, Adam, we've got a big slate to talk about today. Do us a favor, guys. Like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. How are you feeling about this 13-game slate with basically nothing but shitty pitchers?
Glad that it's not yesterday's slate because that didn't go particularly well for me. So I typically don't really mind slates like this because I think it just opens the door to, it makes it a little bit easier to just be contrarian in tournaments, which I think is fun. It's always a little bit difficult when you're in the situation where it's like, like even though it didn't work out yesterday, obviously, like most of the good pitchers also sucked. It's always kind of difficult when you're going into a slate and it's just like, oh, well, there's 4 really good pitchers and then everybody else isn't good. And those 4 pitchers are all getting ownership. What do I do? Like that can get kind of difficult. I kind of enjoy the slates where it's like, certain pitchers are still going to get ownership because they're the best of the group. But it just makes it easier to get away from and be contrarian when they're getting ownership just because of a lack of alternatives as opposed to what they actually are as a pitcher.
And just for reference on how iffy the pitchers are today, Yusei Kikuchi is nearly 40% owned on a 13-game slate. This is what pitching has come to today, but we'll be breaking all of that down as we go game by game, starting with the New York Yankees at the Pittsburgh Pirates. Also something to be aware of with today's slate. There are a bunch of games that have weather concerns, and this is potentially one of them. So last night we saw the Braves game, for instance, got a rain delay in the middle of the game. I really like Kyle Wright as a contrarian pitching option. He got off to a great start, especially in the first inning. And then that game ultimately ended up getting resumed later, but the starting pitchers didn't come back. So pay attention to the weather. There's some potential rain in Pittsburgh. The game that is potentially most problematic is the Mets-Reds game. We're just going to break down all the games as is. Nothing's in a spot where I'm like, oh, this game's for sure getting canceled. So once again, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and then check out the deeper dive and live before lock later in the day when we really have a better sense for what some of these weather situations are going to look like.
Also, anyway, if you're somebody that uses spreadsheets, we have Luis Garcia pitching and hitting today, so leave yourself an extra couple of minutes to fix that.
And then also potentially relief pitcher Luis Garcia as well. Lots of Luis Garcias. One of them is going to be a very popular pitching option. But talking about the first game on the slate, Yankees Pirates, one of those games with potential rain in the forecast. Jameson Taillon's on the mound for the Yankees, and typically he's not a pitcher I love for DFS purposes because he doesn't generate a whole lot of strikeouts, 19.8% K rate. And when he's this expensive on a 13-game slate, I would almost never want to get to Jameson Taillon. But I kind of feel like we're forced to, at least to some extent today, because the pitching options are so thin. So Taillon, 10,000 on DraftKings, only projected for 6% ownership. Is this a contrarian guy you want to pay up for?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable because he is, I think, one of the more talented pitchers, just given that there's not many talented pitchers on this slate. He's got a good matchup against Pittsburgh. The big thing for me, though, is the lack of ownership. If you told me that Jameson Taillon was 10K and getting 30% ownership or something, I think it would be pretty easy to just say, like, yeah, I'll take my chances and go somewhere else instead of paying 10K for a pitcher with a slightly shy of 20% strikeout percentage. But he doesn't walk guys. He does have a good 3.67 xFIP. He's allowing less than a home run per 9. He's got the good matchup against Pittsburgh. Given that he's not getting much ownership, and this is a 13-game slate, so there's just going to be cheap hitters that you can use. That's pricing hasn't been particularly sharp all year. There's no reason to think it's going to be a slate where you can't just find value bats. So I don't think the salary on Taillon is actually that much of an issue. So I do like the idea of getting to him as long as the ownership stays relatively low.
Yeah, and just to reiterate a point that I've been talking about a lot, especially on some shows with Josh, just the pitching has totally changed in terms of pricing, especially on DraftKings, to where a lot of times the best pitchers on the slate, and I know that last night, basically all of the top pitchers other than Orioles sucked, but we're getting pretty often the best pitching options are in the 8 and 9K range. And I mean, the best is in terms of guys that we've projected for the most fantasy points. So it just lessens the need to go really cheap for shitty offenses. So a team like the Pirates on the other side, especially when we aren't getting Jameson Taillon with much ownership, this is not an appealing stack for me to get to. Do you see it any differently?
Not particularly. It's not a very good offense at all. The matchup's not good. Like, Taillon doesn't strike out a lot of guys, but he's still good at limiting power. If you want to go to some of these hitters individually, I think that's okay. But even the price tags have come up a bit. Brian Reynolds is at 4,800. O'Neal Cruz is good, but he's at 3,900 now. Even Vogelbach's up to 3,300. So overall, I think it's a pretty tough offense to get to.
And on the other side, it's going to be Jose Quintana pitching for the Pirates. And I don't have any interest in Quintana in this spot. I'm going to assume it's the same for you, although I'll let you respond to that in a second. But as for the Yankees as an offense, we have them with the second highest top stack odds on the slate. And the ownership looks about fair, 8% ownership, 8% top stack odds. So I think the Yankees are a team to get to, especially the right-handed power bats. What do you make of the Quintana matchup against the Yankees?
Yeah, I like New York here. I mean, obviously, I'd prefer them if they were hitting in New York. Quintana's been okay this year, but he has really, really had issues with right-handed hitters. He's been lights out against lefties, but you have a ton of right-handed power in this lineup. He's only struck out 19% of righties, 211 expected ISO, and you're getting, Judge, Stanton, Donaldson, Torres, LeMahieu, Hicks, Trevino. The only lefty expected to be in the lineup is Rizzo, who is just good in general. So they're not getting a ton of ownership right now. We have the Yankees with about an 8% chance of being the top stack, about 8% projected ownership. I do really like getting to them here.
Yeah, and there's very few teams on this slate where the ownership I would consider to be problematic, but one of them is in this next game that we're talking about, the Washington Nationals against the Philadelphia Phillies. So on a slate where we don't really have that much ownership going offense, it's kind of spread around. There's two teams that are massively popular, and one of them is the Phillies. It's a good matchup against Paulo Espino, but 13.1% ownership for them compared to a 5.8% chance to be a top stack. This is the most negatively leveraged team we have in the top stacks tool. Do you think the ownership on Philly is warranted in this spot?
I'm kind of surprised we have their top stack percentage so low because I think this is a very good spot against Espino and the Nats. It's in Philly, which we know is a good hitter's park. I don't really have much of an issue with the ownership here, especially when you look at the team as a whole. Kyle Schwarber's pulling 23%. Yes, that's a lot, especially on a 13-game slate, but it's still obviously a very good spot. Castellanos, Hoskins, Real Muto, all between 14 and 20%. But after that, you have a $2,700 Derek Hall at 7%, $2,700 Herrera at 6%, Stott, Gregorius, both at 6%, Alec Baum at 4%. This is a team where you can, as a stack, you can mitigate some of that ownership by mixing in those other guys. Derek Hall, in particular, does have a lot of power. He's first base only. Rhys Hoskins is first base only. So you're going to get more people going to Hoskins, deservedly so. But you can just pivot to Hall at 1/3 the ownership and be contrarian right there. Espino gives up power to righties and lefties. 177 expected ISO to lefties, 226 to righties. So yeah, again, I'm kind of surprised that the top stack percentage is as low as it is right now. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that come up. And I think the ownership is fine individually.
And what do you make of Paulo Espino's numbers this year? Because I think part of the reason that influences that, he's really not been bad this year. He's a 2.8 ERA and a 4 FIP. One thing to note about that is that he's primarily worked out of the bullpen. We've seen him move back into a starting role, and he's seemingly stretched out now. His last 3 starts, 5 innings, 5 1/3 innings, 4 1/3 innings. And he's been much less effective as a starter than a reliever. He has a 5.4 FIP as a starter. So I do wonder if some of the numbers for Paulo Espino overall for the season, you might just look at service level and be like, well, he hasn't been that bad, but it's just easier to be successful as a reliever than a starter. Do you think that could be the thing that's kind of driving down the top stack odds?
Yeah, I think that's possible, but I also think that our top stack odds are generally derived mostly from implied run totals. That's why I'm kind of surprised that they have a 5.3 implied run total.
Yeah, they have is this the highest on the slate? It's close to the highest. There's a bunch of teams that are grouped kind of close together. Phillies, Braves, Astros, but yeah, there's the Dodgers being another one. But yeah, there's no real team that we have as being, way significantly higher than them. And some of the teams that we do have with higher top stack odds actually do have lower implied team totals. So yeah, I agree with you that I think that number could use to come up a little bit, but still, at least as of now, projected to be the most popular team on the slate.
Also, to your point about Espino's, numbers probably being worse as a starter, I agree with that completely. But also, it seems like he's just gotten pretty lucky too. Like if against lefties this year, he's held them to an ISO below 100, but a 177 expected ISO. His expected WOBA to lefties is 70 points higher than his actual WOBA allowed. Expected WOBA to righties, 327 compared to 314, 226 expected ISO compared to 183. He's gotten hit by righties regardless, but even there, it looks like he's gotten a little lucky. And against lefties, it just seems like he should be doing much worse than he has so far.
Yeah, and we also have a track record of Espino not being good. He had a 4.27 ERA and a 4.89 expected ERA last year. And then the year before, he only pitched 6 innings. The year before that, 24 innings. He had a 6 ERA, a 7.04 expected ERA. So overall, for the course of his career, this has not been a good pitcher. So I'm expecting regression for Paulo Espino going forward. One of the main indicators of that, Zips hasn't projected with a 5.14 ERA the rest of the season. Steamer 4.9. I don't believe in anything Espino's done to this point.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
And on the other side of the game, it's going to be Christopher Sanchez starting for the Phillies. And we have very little information on him as well. Is there anything that you really know about Christopher Sanchez?
Just looking at his FanGraphs page, he's 25.5. They have him ranked as Philadelphia's 28th prospect. So essentially a total non-prospect. This is his second time in the majors. Last year, 19 games, 17 starts. Oh, sorry, that was a AAA. Last year, 7 games in the majors, 1 start, 12 2/3 total innings. This year, he's made 1 start in 8 appearances, 15 2/3 total innings. Doesn't seem likely to be very good.
Yeah, and we have Steam actually has a decent projection on him, although they do have him working as a reliever this year, which is also going to make him look a little bit better. Now, something else to talk about here is how much do you think we're seeing out of him in this game? Because he's just been a reliever. Well, actually, kind of weird. He was a long reliever earlier in the season when we saw him pitching 2-3 innings at a time. But as of late, he's only been pitching 1 inning at a time. Do you think he's more stretched out than that? Or is this just going to essentially be a bullpen game?
So his most recent outing at AAA, he went 3 innings. He went 4 innings prior to that. I would expect that if the Phillies can get 4 innings out of him here, they would be very happy.
So that's going to make not that I think we were considering Christopher Sanchez all that much anyway, but that's going to make him difficult to consider. But what does that do for the Nationals on the other side of this game?
It does make them look pretty appealing. The issue for them is that you do have so Soto may or may not be in the lineup. He's been banged up. If he's in the lineup, even lefty lefty, I think it looks good because for one, we don't expect Sanchez to go that deep into this game, and for two, it's Juan Soto. But the price tags have come up a little bit, particularly in the middle of the order. Josh Bell's up to 5K. Cruz is at 4,500 now. Outside of that, though, they are still pretty inexpensive. Lane Thomas likely to lead off at a cheap $3,200 price tag. Keibert Ruiz is 3,700. So I think that they look okay, but they do only have a 4.2 implied run total. We have them right now with about a 3.5% chance of being the top stack, about 2% aggregate ownership. So I think they're more of a middle of the road team that I'll get to, to get some contrarian bats, but not a huge priority for me.
All right, let's move on to the next game. And this is a shitty pitching matchup. Rangers, Orioles, Austin Voth on the mound against Spencer Howard. Let's get this out of the way. Fair to assume that there's no interest in rostering either of these pitchers.
Yeah.
So Spencer Howard, we haven't really seen pitch all that much this year, but we have a track record of him not being good. And then on the other side, Austin Voth, kind of similar. We know that he has not been good for an extended period of time. So starting with the Austin Voth side of the game, him on the mound for the Baltimore Orioles this year, he's also primarily worked out of the bullpen. 7.34 ERA, 5.3 expected ERA. His most recent outings have been a little bit extended, but still not going deep into games. 3 innings, 2 2/3 innings. The Orioles bullpen has been better than I think a lot of people expected this year. So if this is going to be a bullpen game, that probably makes this a little bit more difficult of a matchup for the Rangers than most people would think. But how do you view the matchup that the Rangers have today? Is this a team to get to?
I think it's fine. You mentioned Baltimore's bullpen being good. I think in some regards they've probably been a little bit lucky as well, but they do have a solid bullpen, especially at the back end. But if you're thinking that Texas gets to Austin Voth early, then you're not worried about what Jorge Lopez and Felix Bautista are doing at the back end. It's more so, can they get to these guys that are going to come in earlier that aren't quite as good or shouldn't be quite as good. So I do think at the very least it's still a high upside spot here. Austin Voth is getting a little bit more stretched out, like you said. He made a spot start 2 starts ago. That was a game where Jordan Lyles was scratched like 3 hours before the game started. He went out there, gave them 3 innings, 47 pitches, threw 62 pitches last time out. Wouldn't be surprised if you saw him get up into like the mid 70s here, but it's still not a pitcher that I'm going out of my way to get to, that's for sure. And it is a pitcher that is not great. So far this year, Voth has allowed a 205 expected ISO to lefties, 202 to righties. So it is a high upside spot for the Rangers.
Now, for the Texas Rangers, who have Spencer Howard on the mound, we've only seen him pitch 6 innings this year, 12.15 ERA, 10.67 expected ERA. Last year, we had a bigger sample size. He pitched 49 innings with a 7.43 ERA, 4.66 expected ERA. There was a point in time when Spencer Howard was one of the top pitching prospects in baseball for the Philadelphia Phillies. At this point, it's hard to believe that he's ever going to pan out. He still throws pretty hard, 96 average mile per hour fastball velocity this year. But at 25 years old, he's really got nothing going at this point. His projections don't look good going forward. He's shown no sign of success at any point at the big league level. First got called up in 2020, negative wins above replacement during that time. I think this is a good spot for Baltimore. A lot has been made about how pitcher-friendly Camden Yards has been this year with the ballpark dimensions changed. But during the summer months where the weather is hotter, I think it's going to be a little bit more neutral of a park, and this is certainly a good spot to get going. And the Orioles offense has been much better over the last month or so than they were in the first month of the season.
So I do want to walk back my lack of interest in Howard a little bit. I agree with you that he certainly hasn't had success at the major league level in the past. Like, that's a fact. The Orioles offense, I think, is also dangerous. I've mentioned it before. The bottom of the order, Odor, Arauz, Mateo, not the best hitters. Odor does have some power, but 1 through 6, like, these guys can all hit. They're all top prospects and/or at this point proven major leaguers. So Mullins, Mancini, Santander, Mountcastle, Rutschman, Hayes, they can certainly give anybody problems. And Spencer Howard has not had success in the majors. The reason I do want to walk back my lack of interest in Howard a little bit, he's only getting 1% ownership. He's $5,700. He went 7 innings in his most recent AAA start. And this season, he has struck out 30.8% of hitters at AAA. Zips projects him for a 24.5% strikeout percentage going forward, 4.76 FIP. Obviously, that's not great. But the point being, like, I do think that there's upside in his arm, and he's not getting ownership and he's cheap. So from that angle, I don't hate it in tournaments. Still, if you had, if you're just going to lay me even money and say, do the Orioles have more success than Spencer Howard? My answer would be yes.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And we do have to look at this slate in the context of the pitching options kind of all suck today. Like there's not going to be a cheap pitching option you could tell me about or be like, oh yeah, I feel great about that guy. Neither can it be for the field. Yusei Kikuchi, while he has strikeout upside, has largely been terrible this season, and he's going to be in 40% of the lineups according to our projections now. So it is really hard to feel good about any of the cheap pitching options on the slate. So I think you have talked me into, over the course of 150 lineups, working in a little bit of Spencer Howard, just from the standpoint of, hey, this guy has strikeout upside, which is more than we could say about almost every other cheap pitcher today.
Right. And I don't even know that you're going to need to get that cheap on the slate, but like you're saying, like at the very least, I think he has strikeout upside. And when you look at where some of the other ownership is going today, like for example, Michael Kopech getting 15% ownership, he's got good strikeout stuff, but he's also not had a ton of success in terms of run prevention. He's got a tough matchup against Minnesota, and he's $3,000 more expensive. My point is just, and I think you agree, it's just that Howard is 1% owned. Like that's worth taking on the risk just to get away from some of the other pitcher ownership.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And then kind of similar thoughts though with Baltimore on the other side. Baltimore's only projected for 1% ownership. So if this is a game where it's kind of a mediocre offense against a bad pitcher who can generate strikeouts and nobody's rostering either of them, 1% on both sides, I do think over the course of 150 lineups, you could talk yourself into being overweight to both sides.
Yeah, it kind of strikes me as strange because like Howard, the knock is that he's unlikely to be good at preventing runs, but he can get strikeouts. The Orioles, it's that at least 1 through 6, they have good power hitters, and maybe the bottom of the order pulls down their lineup as a whole. But it's hard for me to look at this matchup and say like, oh yeah, I think there's a really good chance that Howard limits runs but doesn't get enough strikeouts to be a good play, or Baltimore scores enough runs for a $5,700 Howard not to be a good play, but then they're not a good play given the power that they have 1 through 6. So both sides of this seem like they're going on their own to me.
All right, let's hit on the next game. We have the Boston Red Sox at home against the Tampa Bay Rays, and finally, we have a legitimately good pitcher to talk about here with strikeout upside. Jeffrey Springs, 27.8% K rate. He's looked really good for Tampa Bay. We're also only about 4 starts removed from him being $6,300 on DraftKings. Now he's considerably more expensive, not one of the most expensive pitchers on the slate, on the road against Boston. So it's not an easy matchup for Springs. But how high of a priority is he going to be for you in tournaments when he's a legitimately good pitcher? And that's something that just doesn't really exist today.
Sorry, I was answering something in chat, but for which pitcher?
For Jeffrey Springs on the mound against for the Rays against the Red Sox.
Yeah, he's legitimately good. The matchup's not great. He did miss his last start because of, I think, a kid. I don't remember for sure. Family medical matter. Yeah, some personal reason. But so he hasn't pitched in the majors since June 24th. Maybe you see him limited a little bit, but I wouldn't expect it to be too much of an issue. He threw 102 pitches there. Even if you say like, oh, okay, now he's going to throw 90, like that's not really an issue, especially on the slate. So I do like Springs. The matchup isn't great. He's only getting 3% ownership though, so that really helps to mitigate the matchup for me. Looking at what he's done this year, 27.8% strikeout percentage. That is obviously good. 3.11 xFIP. Certainly think he's one of the more talented pitchers on today's slate.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. And right now, in terms of projected ownership for him, we have him projected for only 3% ownership over on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's projected for 1% ownership, where he's only 8,400. I know the matchup is tough against the Red Sox, but is it surprising to you that nobody seems to be getting to him right now?
Yeah, it is. Kind of in the same sense that I was surprised that Tyone's not getting more ownership, except for Springs obviously has better strikeout stuff. But it just kind of seems right now, at least, like ownership is moving even more aggressively towards like mediocre pitchers that just are in good matchups as opposed to actual good pitchers that are in a little bit more difficult matchups. So yeah, like maybe we see that Springer or the Springs ownership come up a bit, but 47.7% ownership going to Luis Garcia compared to 3% for Springs seems pretty crazy. The other reason I think that's pretty crazy is that obviously Garcia has the better matchup, but the only real, outside of Boston being a good offense, the other potential concern on Springs is that maybe he is a little bit more limited than usual. Luis Garcia is limited every single time he pitches. Houston will not let him go through the order a third time unless he's just pitching absolutely out of his mind. So if you're going to have half the field go to a guy who we know is going to throw 90 pitches because we're afraid that Springs might be limited to 90 pitches, that doesn't make a ton of sense to me.
No, the other side, the Red Sox are actually kind of picking up some ownership against him. 4.5% ownership going to the Red Sox as a stack. I know this is a potent offense with a fairly high implied run total. I actually think, considering how good Springs has looked this year, I think the implied run total for the Red Sox is probably a little higher than what it should be. But that's also leading to some people looking at that and saying they want to stack up the Red Sox. I don't have nearly as much interest in Boston as the field, especially when they're this expensive. I would just rather get different than them at offense because there's just much worse pitchers to target.
Yeah, agreed. Somebody in chat just said, yeah, but Boston has so many righties. Jeffrey Springs has struck out 28.5% of righties this year. His best pitch is his changeup, which neutralizes opposite-handed hitters more so than same-handed hitters. He's thrown it 45% of the time with a 23% swinging strike percentage this year. He has no issue getting righties out. As a whole, like, yeah, Boston's offense is good. This game is also in Fenway as opposed to Tropicana, so that's a negative for Springs, but he's not somebody that you just automatically look at a lineup and say, like, oh, they have a lot of righties, it's not good for him. He can still get those strikeouts. So if his ownership were to come up, like if you tell me he's the same ownership as Luis Garcia, I clearly prefer Luis Garcia. If you tell me it's close, I prefer Garcia. The matchup's better and all of that, but I don't think I think this gap is way too big. And getting to the Red Sox, I'm not really that interested in it. They do have good hitters. It is a good park to hit in and all of that. But 4% projected ownership, 5% chance of being the top stack. They're just kind of there for me.
Yeah, and then one other thing too, he's a reverse splits pitcher, and at least from what we've seen, we haven't seen him pitch that much at the big league level, but he's been considerably better against righties than against lefties. Against righties, to what you said before about the strikeout rate, he's a 28.5% strikeout rate against righties, 25.8% against lefties. He also has a lower walk rate against righties than lefties. So do with this what you will, but his FIP against right-handed pitchers this year is 2.68. It's 5.15 against lefties. I don't care at all if the Red Sox have a lot of righties. That's not been an issue for him this year, to what you said before.
Yeah, and there are several people are mentioning the weather here. Obviously, it's kind of a waste of time at 11:30 in the morning to speculate too much on weather. Right now, it's looking like it's supposed to just be light showers during the game, in which case they'll probably be fine. It most likely, at least the way it looks right now, it's one of those where it's like either, my guess is they would either call it before the game, in which case you'll know, and obviously don't play these guys. But if it's just light rain and they start in it, you should be safe. That's the way it looks right now. Obviously, keep an eye on that later, though.
Yeah, and also there's a handful of games that have weather concerns. None of them are crazy problematic right now. But once again, we're going to have more information later on in the day, unless there's something where it's like, oh, we're looking at tornadoes or a game definitely getting canceled. I generally tend to just want to talk about it on the strategy show as if it's going to happen. And then later on in the day, when I'm doing live before lock, then I could actually say to you guys, hey, you know what? This game looks like the weather's going to be bad. I'm just taking it out of my player pool. So check out the content later in the day, and then we'll really have a better indication of what some of these weather situations are going to look like. On the other side, Nick Pivetta is on the mound for Boston. Fairly difficult matchup for him against the Rays. Pivetta is also really expensive, 23.6% strikeout rate this year. So not terrible, but not great either. But one thing about Pivetta is we just talked about guys like Jameson Taillon and Jeffrey Springs that aren't picking up that much ownership. And Pivetta is quite a bit more popular than those guys right now. For instance, 2.8% projected for Jeffrey Springs compared to 9.6 for Pivetta. I don't think Pivetta warrants 3 to 4x the ownership of somebody like Jeffrey Springs.
Yeah, agreed. I think he's a reasonable play. And I do think he is probably going a little bit under-owned as well, in the sense that, like, it depends who you compare him to. If you compare him to Luis Garcia getting nearly 50% ownership and Pivetta's at 10 for $800 more, I like getting to a little bit more Pivetta there. But I agree with you, if you compare him to Springs, who's $600 less, even those two I think should be probably a little bit closer in terms of ownership. Pivetta has pretty much always had good strikeout stuff. He's done a better job limiting home runs this year so far, allowing 0.95 home runs per 9. But he's also somebody who seems like he's been getting pretty lucky in that department. Expected ISO to lefties is about 75 points higher than his actual ISO. Expected ISO to righties is about 90 points higher than his actual ISO. So he does, and then, also just knowing, the kind of pitcher that he's been throughout his career, it's very likely that you start to see some home runs against Nick Pivetta going forward. May or may not be today, but I do think that's one thing to keep in mind. But either way, 23.5% strikeout percentage looks pretty good. The Rays lineup is getting better. You should have Kiermaier, Franco's back, but it's still not the best lineup here. So at relatively low ownership, I like Pivetta. If that ownership were to come up and, he starts getting closer to Luis Garcia, then I still think just going to the matchup against KC starts to look better.
And I don't want to play the Rays on the other side. I don't understand. The Rays are currently projected for the 5th most ownership on the slate, and they're projected for similar ownership to the Yankees going up against Jose Quintana, the Dodgers against German Marquez. Pavetta's been better than both Quintana and Marquez this year. The Yankees and Dodgers both have a better offense than the Rays. I'm kind of confused by the amount of ownership going to them.
Yeah, all I can think of is that it is a positive park shift. They are also pretty inexpensive. The most expensive hitters in this lineup, well, the most expensive hitters are Rosarena. After that, Franco and Paredes are both 4,200. So that probably has something to do with it as well. It'll let you pay up for Luis Garcia and whatever else people are paying up for today. So that looks pretty good. And like I said, I do think Pivetta starts to give up some more home runs going forward. Looking at the ownership individually, though, for Tampa Bay, I think that the highest owned guy is Ramirez at 12%. He's 2,700. I do like the 10% ownership coming into Wander Franco. That's just a really cheap price tag for him.
Yeah, and I don't know that he's ever going to be as good for fantasy as he will be for real life, just because so many of the things he does in real life just don't matter that much for fantasy. Being a really well-rounded player is like, hey, he's going to draw a bunch of walks. He's going to play plus defense, and that's going to make him a 6-win player in real life. But he still warrants being more expensive than what he currently is right now. So, yeah, as a one-off, I certainly think he makes sense. Anything else you want to mention from this game?
Nope.
All right. If you guys want access to all of the great Stokastic Plus tools and content for nearly every single DFS sport out there, you can sign up for a Stokastic Plus Platinum Pass. And if you're signing up for the first time, use the promo code MLB Strategy Show. It'll get you 50% off your first month of Stokastic Plus Platinum. Get access to all the stuff like the top stacks tool, top pitchers tool, ownership projections, player projections, all stuff that's pivotal when building MLB lineups. And then, of course, we have you covered for basically every single other sport out there as well. Stop guessing, start winning. Join Stokastic Plus today. All right, next game to hit on is the Cleveland Guardians against the Detroit Tigers. And another game where we don't have great pitchers on the mound. Cal Quantrill for Cleveland. Drew Hutchison is going to be on the mound for Detroit. Do you see anything that's going to be redeeming about these pitchers that makes you want to play them today? Both of them have strikeout rates around 15%.
The only thing that I guess would be redeeming for Quantrill is that he's facing the Tigers.
Yeah.
But he's still such a bad strikeout pitcher. It's tough for me to really want to get there. We have him projected for 8% ownership right now at 8,300. I get it. The Tigers are one of the worst offenses in baseball, but this is someone that, even on a slate where the pitching isn't very good, has one of the lowest strikeout percentages at 14.6%, 4.75 xFIP. It's just like, yeah, you can just get strikeouts because you're facing Detroit, but at the same time, they are still major league hitters. Like 14.5% strikeout percentage for Quantrill. There's a good chance these guys that typically have trouble putting the ball in play are just able to make contact.
Yeah, and when it comes to the Detroit Tigers, it's Cal Quantrill doesn't present a difficult matchup, but I just never really want to play the Tigers against righties. And then something else that brings in what we were talking about before, the pitching sucks today. And if there's ever a time to play the Tigers, it's because I need the value to pay up for stud pitching. That is not the case today. I have no interest in getting to Detroit as a stack.
Individually, I think Riley Green looks like a good value at 2,500. But like you were saying, the rest of it, like they're really cheap. I mean, half this lineup is. There are 5 guys in this lineup on DraftKings in the projected lineup that are 2K flat. There's another one at 2,200, a 2,300. Riley Green at 2,500 is the second most expensive hitter, and then you have Javi Baez at 5,700. I don't know how that happens, but
sucks.
Yeah, it's like I have no issue whatsoever with Riley Green. He's one of the top hitting prospects in baseball. He's in a good spot against Quantrill. He's insanely cheap. But to your point, even though they're really cheap, this strikes me as a slate where you're probably not going to get there by just getting like a good value stack and then, winning a GPP with like 180 points or something. You really still on a 12 game slate are going to need Willie Castro and Candelario and Torkelson and Clemens to like put up legitimate fantasy games. And that's a pretty tough ask.
We only have them projected with a 1.8% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate. They are picking up some ownership at 3.6% because of how cheap they are. But what do I need the salary savings for? Like, I'm gonna do that to play more of Nick Pivetta against the Rays. Like, it's just kind of unnecessary. On the other side of this game, we also have a really, really popular offense because going up against Hutchison, the Guardians are currently the second most popular team on the entire slate, only slightly behind the Philadelphia Phillies. So we're seeing Cleveland projected for 13% ownership. Do you think the ownership on this team is warranted? One of only two teams on the slate that have an ownership north of 10%.
Yeah, it's kind of like Philadelphia for me though, where when you look at it individually, I'm not that concerned about it. Jose Ramirez is really driving the ownership here. He has a 27% ownership projection. He's $4,900. He's clearly one of the best plays on the slate. He's top third base option. You can play him in tournaments, just pay attention to the rest of your lineup. But that's what's really pulling up the ownership for this team. After that, you have 16% going to Franmil Reyes, who's also very cheap. Steven Kwan at 13%, Rosario and Jimenez, the other two guys in double digits. Josh Naylor is only 9%. The Malley, Straw, and Palacios are 6% or less. So the guys that you would want from this team are popular, but they're also really cheap. The matchup against Hutchison's really good. He hasn't been a good pitcher ever, basically, this year in a limited sample. 259 expected ISO to righties, 203 to lefties. Go back to last year, sample size gets a little bit bigger, 200 expected ISO to righties, 152 to lefties. He's got a tough matchup against Cleveland. I understand why the ownership's there, and I do think that Ramirez is just kind of pulling up that aggregate ownership a little bit more, so it's kind of misleading.
Next game to hit on here, it is going to be the Cardinals on the road against the Braves. Palante on the mound for the Cards, and then we've got Ian Anderson for the Braves. So Ian Anderson, in terms of the totality of pitchers on the slate, I think Ian Anderson is one of the more talented ones, but he's had a little bit of a letdown this season. The strikeouts aren't there, and he's facing one of the teams that are the most difficult for pitchers to strike out. The Cardinals, even though it's a right-hand dominant lineup that's better against lefties than righties, they make contact, they put the ball in play against righties. So at a 19.6% K rate for Ian Anderson, it's really hard to project him for many strikeouts in this spot.
Yeah, this spot really scares me for him. He's getting 9% ownership at 8,500. I think that's reasonable. To me, he's kind of the opposite of Cal Quantrill, where like Quantrill just does not get strikeouts, but he's facing a Tigers team that, occasionally I could probably strike out 7 or 8 guys against. For Anderson, in theory, he has good strikeout stuff. He always has before this year. But even if you were to just throw out what he's done this year, you take this matchup against the Cardinals, and it would be like, okay, this guy's got solid strikeout stuff, but he's facing a team that is really good at hitting and doesn't strike out. Then you add in what he has done this year, where he's only struck out 20.5% of hitters. That's a concern, or sorry, 19.5% of hitters. That's a concern on its own. So, like, from a talent standpoint, I think he's more talented than Quantrill, but I also think that this matchup is much more difficult. So I understand why the two of them are getting 8 to 9% ownership apiece.
So what do you? Sorry, this is really bugging me. So a little back and forth you had with our friend in here who claims to win parlays like a 98% clip or whatever it is in YouTube chat. He seems to think that Oakland is a better hitter's park than Coors Field. What do you make of that?
That's a fantastic take. I hung out with a girl on Saturday, and she said that she had tried to get into sports betting and followed some pick service that kept saying to like make parlays, and that she was getting her ass kicked. I wonder if it was the same person.
Could be.
Maybe they also thought that the Oakland Coliseum was better than Coors Field.
I mean, it's certainly a unique take. Vegas Dave, maybe? Is this a Vegas Dave burner? I've never seen somebody say that Oakland is a better hitter's park than Coors Field, but whatever it is that floats your boat. We've got more baseball games to talk about, and on the other side of this game, Andre Palante, or for whatever reason, the run sheet, I actually wrote Neil Palante. Sorry, Tyler. That's my mess up. Andre Palante on the mound today for the Cardinals. He's produced pretty good results this year with a 2.1 ERA, 3.64 expected ERA. Also has generally worked out of the bullpen, but there's been no strikeouts to be seen, only a 14.3% K rate. So the ball's probably going to be put in play against him. We know how potent the Braves offense is. How high of a priority is Atlanta for you? They've looked good on a number of slates lately, and this looks like another one of those for me.
Yeah, the issue with Palante is that he's done a very good job keeping the ball on the ground. So that's helped him to limit power, but he doesn't strike guys out. He's only allowed 0.65 home runs per 9, but a 14.3% strikeout percentage, 3.94 xFIP is good. But the last time he pitched, it was a show that Alex and I were doing together, and the thing with pitchers like this is, on average, when they're on top of their game, they're going to get you to hit a lot of ground balls. It's going to limit your power numbers and all of that. But when you get them against an offense like Atlanta, the margin for error is so small. If you're going to let the Braves put the ball in play, if you're not on top of your game, you're just going to get destroyed, because you're going to be leaving hittable pitches that are up, and they're just going to get launched. So I don't mind taking offenses against ground ball pitchers. The thinking is basically that for most pitchers, if they're on, you're not going to have success. Like, major league pitchers are really, really good. But you have a bigger margin for error if you're throwing like 99 miles an hour and getting swings and misses than you do if you are relying on getting ground balls. if you're off by a little bit, you're going to just get torched. So I don't mind taking high upside offenses against guys like this, even though, more often than not, you're just going to be frustrated because you're going to get a lot of ground balls. Getting to Atlanta is certainly very appealing to me.
It's funny, though, at the same time, it's somewhat similar to the matchup they had against Dakota Hudson yesterday. And well, it looked like the Braves were going to put up a big number on Dakota Hudson. Then what happens? We get a rain delay. The game all stops. They come back, and there's just no runs scored post rain delay, or at least not that much offense happens afterwards. But they scored, was it 6 runs in 2 innings on Dakota Hudson yesterday? So potentially something similar could happen against Palante. And then also when it comes to Atlanta, they only project for 3% ownership. They're expensive today, but that's not problematic for me. So 3% is a number that I think is worth getting overweight to the field too.
Yeah, completely agree.
All right, let's hit on the next game, which is the Houston Astros at home against the Kansas City Royals. We've talked about Luis Garcia being the most popular pitcher on the slate, 25.7% K rate, 1.06 whip. The Royals don't have a great offense. Luis Garcia is solid. You mentioned some of the concerns about he doesn't often work very deep into games, but the pitching options suck today. He's clearly one of the safer options on the board. So what are you going to be doing with him in tournaments when he's projected for nearly 50% ownership?
I'm still going to roster him. It's just a matter of getting to contrarian hitters or contrarian SP2s with him. It's a matter of what the rest of your team looks like, but still expect to have plenty of him. He does project as the best pitcher on the main slate. We have an 18.8 DraftKings points. The matchup against Kansas City is fine. He's a good pitcher. I mean, he has a 25.7% strikeout percentage, 3.68 xFIP this year. I understand why the ownership is coming in. I think that within individual lineups, there are certainly some profitable pivots you can make, whether that's to Pivetta or Springs or Tyone or whatever. But also think he's the top pitching option, and I expect to have plenty.
For sure, we could agree that on the other side of the game, Zach Greinke is not a top pitching option today. And I think that we are a little short on the Houston Astros as a team in the top stacks tool today. And if the Astros are actually only going to be picking up 2.9% ownership against Zach Greinke, give me all of the Houston today. Greinke has been miserable. He does not generate swing and misses. The Astros have a ton of power in their lineup. Is there anything I'm missing here? Because this seems like the perfect spot for Houston, and they're just not getting ownership.
No, it seems great to me. I mean, they're expensive. Maybe that's why the ownership isn't coming in as high. Altuve's 5,800, Alvarez is 6K, Bregman's 4,800, Tucker's 52. You can use the bottom of the order to offset some of that. Jeremy Pena likely hitting second at 4,300 looks like a pretty good value. But also, I just don't care that much about paying up for pitching on this slate either. If I have to use a Spencer Howard at 1% or roll the dice on some of these mid-range guys and hope for the best so that I can get to these Astros bats, that's perfectly fine with me, because even Luis Garcia, he projects for 18 DraftKings points, and he's the highest. None of these top-end pitchers are projecting high enough where I think it's going to really force me to get away from the offenses I want to get to. Zach Greinke's been horrible this year. 245 expected ISO to righties with a 15% strikeout percentage, 182 to lefties with a 7.8% strikeout percentage. There is tons of power in this Houston lineup. I'm with you. I'm surprised they're not getting more ownership. I'm kind of surprised the top stack percentage isn't higher also, but I really like the Astros.
Yeah, and Greinke's ERA this year, it's not good, but it's not completely miserable at 4.38, but he's a 5.32 expected ERA. He's generating no swing and misses. And I'm actually kind of curious to see what some of the matchups he's had this year, because off the top of my head, he has been in a lot of easy matchups, recent starts. Yeah, he has actually generally faced pretty easy offenses this year. He made one Coors Field start where he got lit up, but it's been a pretty easy strength of schedule overall for Zach Greinke. This is definitely the most difficult matchup he's had to date going up against the Houston Astros. This is just not the spot to be allowing contact and not generating swing and misses, especially like you said, the strikeout rate is so low against lefties. Greinke has one total start this year with more than 4 strikeouts. If he's just going to be allowing contact to guys like Kyle Tucker and to guys like Yordan Alvarez, he's going to get his ass kicked. So I think this is a really good spot for Houston. As of now, if I had to enter my lineups knowing the information if this was the accurate information, them only being 2.9% owned as a stack, I think this would be my favorite stack on the entire slate for contrarian purposes.
Yeah, right there with you. I think they look fantastic.
All right, let's move on to the Milwaukee Brewers at home against the Chicago Cubs. And it is 2 more pitchers that don't generate strikeouts. Kyle Hendricks, very rare that Kyle Hendricks will have a start where he is nearly double the strikeout rate of the opposing pitcher. But that's what we have today. Kyle Hendricks, 18.1% K rate against Jason Alexander, 10.9% K rate. Are these 2 more pitchers we don't have interest in today?
Yeah, I think that is pretty fair to say.
And then Jason Alexander, he is going to be another guy who gets hit really hard going forward, in my opinion. He's 29 years old, totally underrated prospect. He's a 3.82 ERA, but a 6.01 expected ERA. I just mentioned how low the strikeouts are for him, but he walks guys. He's a 10.9% strikeout rate to a 9.4% walk rate. He does generate some ground balls, so that's one positive for him. But considering it took him until he was 29 years old to get called up to the big league level, doesn't have great stuff, doesn't generate swing and misses. I know the Cubs don't have a great offense, but I think this is a playable spot for them against Alexander.
Yeah, this guy just seems like a worse version of Payante, honestly. He did have a 63% ground ball percentage at AAA this year. It's at 50.5% so far in the majors. Last year at AAA, 68.6% ground ball percentage. He's good at getting ground balls, but he's not good at getting strikeouts. He does walk too many guys. The margin for error on this guy is just really, really small. So, yeah, there's going to be games where you're going to roster guys against Jason Alexander and you're going to watch them not score runs and you're going to be like, how the hell aren't they hitting Jason Alexander? But you're also just going to get some games where this guy gets absolutely lit up by major league hitters. And the Cubs do have some power in their lineup. You have Suzuki back. He is 5,300, but that's a nice power bat. Ian Happ has power. Wisdom has power. Horner is a top prospect. They're not a great offense overall, but they're not bad either. It's a pretty solid park to hit in. I like getting to bats against Jason Alexander and just hoping that he's not locating quite as well as he needs to get infinite ground balls.
Yeah, and once the Cubs offense is not good, but it's not as bad as Jason Alexander. That and the key point that you hit on before, say Suzuki came back a couple of days ago. With him back in the lineup, that's a potent bat we're adding to the Cubs lineup. So I like this spot for the Cubs. I think they're a decent team to get to. In terms of ownership, only projected for 2.2% ownership. That's a number to be overweight to. One thing that is a little concerning is once you get past Jason Alexander, the Brewers have a really good bullpen, but Josh Hader's pitched in back-to-back days. They had an extra inning game yesterday against the Cubs. So I do think the Brewers bullpen could be a little bit exhausted right now. Brad Boxberger also pitched yesterday. Devin Williams, if I'm not mistaken, has also pitched each of the last couple of days. So there's a chance that this is also a watered-down version of the Brewers bullpen.
Yeah, one other thing to keep in mind with Alexander, typically guys that rely on sinkers, two-seamers, whatever you want to call it, will have pretty drastic splits a lot of the time. And that's been the case with him so far. He doesn't strike out anybody, regardless of what side of the plate they hit from. But sub 100 actual ISO and sub 100 expected ISO to righties this year, 200 actual ISO to lefties, 289 expected ISO. Even if you just want to grab individual hitters, Ian Happ really, I think, stands out as the best power hitting lefty in this lineup.
And there was a point in time when Kyle Hendricks he never had good stuff, but he used to make it work and was a solid pitcher for a really long time. Those days are well gone. Last year, he had a 4.77 ERA and a 4.95 expected ERA. This year, 4.76 ERA, 5.06 expected ERA. More or less, this is a replacement level player at this point in his career. There is a ton of power in the Milwaukee Brewers lineup. Is this another offense that makes sense to get to?
Yeah, if I had to play a pitcher here, I guess it would be Hendricks, and you're just hoping for the best. But primarily, I just like the offense here. Milwaukee's got plenty of power. We have them with a 3% chance of being the top stack. The power upside here is just really appealing to me. Hendricks so far this year against lefties, only striking out 19.5%, 283 actual ISO, 292 expected ISO. Righties have a 127 actual ISO, but still a 173 expected ISO. And like you said, there's a lot of power here. You have Rowdy Tellez at 4,500. His price tag's come up, but he still looks good. Christian Yelich, most likely leading off. Colton Wong from the left side is reasonably priced. Narvaez is a reasonably priced catcher. And then you do have some right-handed bats as well with Adames, McCutchen, and Urias. So I like the Brewers here. Kind of surprised that they aren't showing up a little bit better in the top stack tool.
Yeah, there's a bunch of offenses that I'd consider to be a little weird getting ownership, considering how bad the pitchers are. Like we talked about it before, the Rays are one of the most popular offenses going up against Nick Pivetta, yet we don't have the Brewers with one of the best ISOs in baseball against right-handed pitching, pick up ownership against Kyle Hendricks. I don't quite get it. So I will see what the ownership looks like later on in the day, but it seems like there's good spots to make some pivots. Any other talking points for you from this game?
Nope.
Today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks. If you're signing up at Prize Picks for the first time and you like free money, sign up using the promo code AWESEMO because you get up to a $100 bonus on your first deposit. Good way to help start building that bankroll. We also have tools over at Awesome or over at Stokastic that can help you build some Prize Picks player cards, especially our projections over at Odd Shop, where we look at all of the player props across the industry. We've projected ROIs, projected win rates. So really useful tool when you're filling out some of those Prize Picks cards. But also, don't forget to sign up using that promo code AWESOME. Get up to a $100 bonus on your first deposit. Few games left to talk about. The next one is the Chicago White Sox at home against the Minnesota Twins. And as far as pitching matchups go, this is one of the better ones of the day. And it doesn't mean the pitching is a great matchup. It's just better than other spots we've seen because Michael Kopech on the mound for the White Sox. Chris Archer, who's been not great from a strikeout perspective for the Twins, but he has been healthy, which is more than we could say about him at other points in his career. So Kopech versus Archer, overall, both of them have been a little bit underwhelming relative to results this year and maybe what we would have expected. But do you want to play either of them in DFS tonight?
Yeah, Kopech in particular, he's getting some ownership. I think he deserves it. This is one game definitely to keep an eye on the weather, but assuming the weather cooperates, Kopech overall this year has a strikeout percentage around 23%. He does walk too many guys, 11.4% walk percentage, 4.75 xFIP. It's not a safe matchup against Minnesota either, but he's a former top prospect. He has good stuff. He actually has pretty drastic strikeout splits too, striking out 28% of lefties compared to 19.5% of righties. He's given up more power to lefties. The Minnesota lineup is typically pretty balanced. Arise isn't going to strike out against anybody, but you have Kepler, Polanco, Gordon, Kirilloff also all expected to be in the lineup and hitting from the left side. So pretty balanced lineup here. Kopech's a pitcher that in general, I just don't really know what to make of him because his stuff is really good. He's supposed to be better than he has been. His splits are weird. His strikeout stuff's been good, but not as good as you probably would have expected. So overall, I don't really know what to make of him. But on a slate like this, where he is only $8,800 and pitching in general is mostly garbage, I have no issue getting him in some lineups.
And then do either of the offenses stand out to you in this spot? Because once again, these pitchers, while they haven't had as much success, particularly Kopech, as I thought he would coming into the season, it's not like either of these offenses are all that desirable to me because I still think Kopech is one of the better talents on the slate. Definitely is some of the best stuff that we have going. Minnesota Twins, they're projected for 4% ownership. And then the Chicago White Sox, who have struggled against right-handed pitching, they're projected for 4% ownership. So I can't really prioritize either of these offenses. Do you see it any differently?
I like the White Sox a little bit more than you do, I think. Archer just doesn't have the same strikeout stuff at this point in his career as he used to. He's giving up power to both sides of the plate. 228 expected ISO to lefties, 201 to righties. And the White Sox have gotten healthier. They do have some power in their lineup now. You have Tim Anderson back. You have Luis Robert. Andrew Vaughn is 4K. He has power. Abreu has some power. You have a really cheap Gavin Sheets. Moncada's cheap. So I am, I think, a little bit more interested in Chicago. That being said, though, there's been plenty of teams on this slate that aren't really popular that I am interested in. So I'm not expecting it so much to be like I jam in the White Sox everywhere so much as I just think that they're going a little bit lower owned than I think that they should be.
All right, it's time to talk about Yusei Kikuchi, who has a 4.74 ERA and a 6.32 expected ERA this year. Negative 0.4 wins above replacement. He is by and large sucked this season, but the one redeeming quality of Kikuchi is a 26.3% K rate. And for tonight's slate, he's pitching against the Oakland A's. So we've gone over some of the pluses and negatives of Kikuchi individually as a pitcher. Now, in terms of ownership today, nearly 40% of the field is rostering him over on DraftKings. And then on FanDuel, also going to be somewhat popular at 15% projected ownership. So we've got a really chalky pitcher in Kikuchi. He's cheap, but he also has kind of sucked this year. So what are you going to do with him in tournaments? Because this, by and large, is the most crazy ownership I think we've seen on any individual pitcher, and it's completely driven by what the outlook of the slate looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to end up rostering him, and I'm also just going to end up hating myself for it. The way that I look at Kikuchi is that he, at $7,800, he's facing Oakland in Oakland. So you think about what he is as a pitcher. He has good strikeout stuff, like you said. Within the context of this slate, he has a higher strikeout percentage than, I mean, he's got a higher strikeout percentage than Luis Garcia. He's got a higher strikeout percentage than Kopech. He's got a higher strikeout percentage than Nick Pivetta. He's got a higher strikeout percentage than Taillon. The only guys, excluding Spencer Howard, since he's barely pitched, you have Jeffrey Springs with a higher strikeout percentage out of the guys that are starting on this slate. So that works. And then you're talking about somebody that really, really struggles with power, but he's pitching in Oakland, which is a park that suppresses power. He's facing an A's team that has a 129 ISO on their active roster. All of that works in his favor. That's not to say he's definitely going to have a good start or anything like that, but he's cheap and one of the best strikeout pitchers on the slate in a good pitcher's park. So all of that means I'm going to get to him. But I do also think, like, when you look at his ownership versus the ownership on basically everybody priced around him within individual lineups, there's no reason you should be afraid to pivot away from Kikuchi if you need to save some ownership. Like, when you look across 150 lineups, I would expect to certainly have more Kikuchi than any of these other mid-range pitchers. But within a lineup, if I have, let's say, Cleveland, and I have, the 27% owned Ramirez and this popular team, there's no reason I can't make a 38% owned Kikuchi into a 1% owned Marquez. Or if I have, a little bit of extra money, into a 9% owned Anderson or an 8% Quantrill, or go down to Spencer Howard at 1%. Like, all of those guys are going to beat Kikuchi often enough that they shouldn't be 1/5 to 1/30th of the ownership. But within an individual lineup, if I've already gotten away from ownership, then there's no reason not to just go to the guy that projects the best in Kikuchi.
And with all that said, is there a reason to get to Oakland as a pivot stack today or for leverage purposes? Because we saw yesterday, Alek Manoah, depending what contest he played, and he was 75% owned in some single entry stuff. And the Oakland A's, it's funny, a lot of people bring up, hey, the A's have kind of been a sneaky team this year. They've ruined some chalk pitchers. You know the reason they've ruined chalk pitchers this year? Because they haven't really. It's just that every single time A's are on a slate, the opposing pitcher is chalk. So anytime the Oakland A's have a decent offensive night, which is going to happen once or twice per week, they've ruined a chalk pitcher because the pitchers against them are chalk every single slate. So I do think the viability of the Oakland offense gets a little bit overstated just for that reason. But Kikuchi individually hasn't been good. So is this a spot to get to them?
If you want to either 5-man or just kind of mix and match anybody from the Laureano, Bethancourt, Murphy, Piscotty, Pinder group, I think that's fine. Like, those guys are all good enough hitters. They do all have power against left-handed pitching. The issue is that, once you get past Kikuchi, that doesn't matter. But they do all have power. They all are reasonably priced. If you're stacking the A's, then obviously you can use guys like Andrews or Noisy as well. But individually, Laureano, I think, looks the best. I do kind of like Bethancourt and Murphy. Piscotty's 2K flat. So I can make the case for getting to them because those guys do have some power. They're really cheap. You're going up against a 40% owned pitcher. Do I think that it's more likely they do well? No, I think if more than 50% of the time, Kikuchi wins out here. But there is at least enough power in the middle of that order, I think, to justify it.
And last night, the Blue Jays, they were a contrarian offense I like getting to. They ended up shitting the bed against Cole Irvin. Another potentially good matchup today against Adrian Martinez. We don't have that much data on him. He's only made 2 big league starts this year, 6.3 ERA, 4.52 expected ERA. In the minor leagues, 13 starts, 5.63 ERA, 5.64 FIP. So he hasn't had that much success in the minor leagues. I know that you're about to point out that it is PCL numbers, but I really don't know that Adrian Martinez is all that good of a pitcher. I am confident the Blue Jays are a good offense despite what happened yesterday. So what are you doing with the Blue Jays matchup tonight against Martinez?
Yeah, I'm with you. Blue Jays are a good offense. I think that Martinez's numbers are not, or Martinez's talent probably isn't as bad as his AAA numbers suggest because of the PCL, but I certainly also don't think he's any good. The only actual issue I have with Toronto is that they are hitting in Oakland. It's a very difficult place to hit for a variety of reasons. 1, the outfield fence being really far. 2, the weather typically not being warm. 3, any foul ball is catchable, basically. So all of that makes it harder to score runs, but they are still projected to go quite a bit under-owned here. 6% chance of being the top stack, 1% aggregate ownership. I still like taking some shots there, even though I hate the park.
Number one leverage stack right now for us, if they're only project for 1% ownership, kind of similar like yesterday, I just don't see any way other than getting to the Toronto Blue Jays because it's a team that always warrants more than 1% ownership. And don't forget, Adam, somebody told us in chat that Oakland's a better hitter's park than Coors Field. So that is
pretty wild to be getting the 1% owned Blue Jays in Coors Field West.
Yeah, exactly. So it's crazy that people don't want to play Toronto at the best hitter's park in the history of baseball. Like, you guys think that Little League ballparks are favorable with the 120-foot marks to left field? You guys haven't seen Oakland yet. So Blue Jays, good spot to get to them as a contrarian team. They're going to remain at 1% ownership. That is pretty crazy to me. Couple games left to talk about. Next one, we have the San Francisco Giants against the Arizona Diamondbacks. Alex Wood has been another fairly disappointing pitcher this year, but he's in a decent enough matchup, 22.5% K rate. Another pitcher who I don't really love getting to Alex Wood, but is this a spot where we kind of have to get exposure to him because of how weak the pitchers are today?
I like getting him here. The price tag I think is reasonable at 9,200. He's got decent enough strikeout stuff, 22.5% strikeout percentage, 3.36 xFIP is one of the best on the slate. Arizona certainly has some right-handed power in their lineup, but overall it's not the best lineup. I think Wood is a good pitcher. It is a negative park shift for him getting out of San Francisco, but I do like getting to Alex Wood here. 20% ownership seems very reasonable to me.
Yeah, and also when it comes to Alex Wood, his underlying numbers are much better than his ERA. So if you just looked at his ERA and be like, oh, 5.03 ERA, you would assume he's having a terrible season. And, relative to expectations, it's been underwhelming, but he's a 3.93 expected ERA, a 3.58 FIP. Here's what's really done him in. A 340 BABIP, that's going to come down as the season winds on, 304 BABIP for his career, and then a 66.8% strand rate. That's 73.8% for his career. So going forward, Alex Wood's going to have much more success than he's had to this point from a run allowance perspective. Zips and Steamer have been projected nearly identical the rest of the year. 3.74 ERA from Zips, 3.76 ERA from Steamer, strikeout rate around 24% projection. So I think Alex Wood should be fine going forward. He's not a pitcher I generally like to roster all that much, and he is somebody who traditionally does slow down in his velocity dips as the season goes on, which we've started to see happen as of late. But still, the underlying numbers suggest a much better pitcher than what we've seen to this point. So Alex Wood, he's better than what a lot of the other shit we have to talk about today.
Pretty much.
And then on the other side, Tyler Gilbert is going to be on the mound for Arizona. The San Francisco Giants, the number one top stack team in our top stacks tool. I don't totally agree with that. And one thing that is really annoying about stacking the Giants is the amount they pinch hit. It's something that always weighs on my mind and somewhat limits the amount that I want to play the Giants. How are you going to handle them today against Tyler Gilbert?
Yeah, that's always concerning, especially when it's them against the lefty, because a lot of times you're going to get Yastrzemski on the bench, you're going to get Peterson on the bench, and those are guys that if this game's competitive down the stretch, they're coming in to hit. But they're also pretty inexpensive. That's also going to be reflected in projections. So it does affect the absolute ceiling. But also, like, if you get a game where the Giants happen to just light up Gilbert and throw up 10 runs in the first 3 innings, then maybe you're going to get Peterson and Yastrzemski just taking the day off because there's no reason to pinch hit down the stretch of a 10-run game. So I do think that there's still that way they can get there. And then also, they're just cheap. And if you get a home run and a double from these guys in the first couple of at-bats, you're still going to be fine. So they do still look pretty good. Wilmer Flores, I like quite a bit. Austin Slater, Darren Ruff, these guys all look solid enough. But I am with you. I'm kind of surprised that I guess I just don't really see what the huge difference is between the Giants and then some of these other teams that we've talked about that have much lower top stack percentages.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get to the Giants just because, like you said, sure, we might have them with the highest top stack odds on the slate. But at the same time, too, I don't know, 7% Giants compared to a 1% owned Toronto Blue Jays, or the Yankees picking up similar ownership, or then some other, the Houston Astros project for 2.9% ownership. Those are going to be higher priorities for me. That and the pinch hit risk always scares the shit out of me when it comes to the Giants. So if all else is equal, that's going to be a tiebreaker for me, but they're also more popular than these other teams.
Yeah, I just have a really hard time with how the Giants are twice as likely to be the top stack as Houston in particular, but also like the White Sox or the Brewers. I mean, these teams all have power in good spots.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think is going to change as the day goes on. So one more time, guys, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and check out the deeper dive and live before lock later in the day. We have a better idea for some of the ownership and some of the projections, because it does look like some of this is going to change later on in the day. And at least as of now, early in the morning, we've only had one run of ownership and only one game left to talk about. That is the Los Angeles Dodgers against the Colorado Rockies. The Rockies, not good on the road, not good against right-hand pitching. That is leading to a lot of ownership going to Mitch White. But in his last 2 starts, White went 4 2/3 innings in 4 innings. So what can we expect to him from a length standpoint? Because it does feel to me like this is a little bit too much ownership going to Mitch White, where he's nearly 30% owned. And I don't know if he's going deeper than 4 innings.
Yeah, that's what kind of concerns me. On the plus side, he threw 80 pitches last game. He threw 75 the game before that. Also, in that last start, he went 4 2/3, which I think is a good sign. Typically, the way I read that is that they were willing to let him get through 5. He probably put guys on base and got taken out. So I don't think it was necessarily like a hard 80 pitch count so much as probably that he was putting guys on base. I didn't go back to double check that, so maybe I'm wrong. But if you're going to expect like 80 to 90 pitches here from White at 7,400, I think that's enough. Typically, especially with guys that are not elite pitchers. Once you start getting higher than that number, that's when you start seeing your fantasy points go backwards anyway. So it takes away the absolute ceiling where, he's not going to go out there and throw a 115 pitch complete game, but it doesn't do a ton to like the average outcome for him, I don't think. And it is a good matchup. It is a good price tag. So far in the majors this year, 22.8% strikeout percentage. At AAA, he only made 2 starts, went 11 and 2/3 innings this year. So mostly he's been in the majors, 6 starts, 11 total appearances. I do like Mitch White. I think the price tag's very reasonable. I get why he's getting the ownership.
All right, final spot to talk about now. German Marquez is going to be on the mound against the Los Angeles Dodgers. It is a park upgrade for German Marquez, but not in the ideal circumstance going up against the Dodgers. Dodgers are going to be popular today. They are the 3rd most popular offense, only behind the Cleveland Guardians and the Philadelphia Phillies. So how do we view the Los Angeles Dodgers? Number one, they are pretty expensive. We've talked about how price isn't that important today relative to other slates, but it is still a little bit difficult to get to all of the salaries from the Dodgers. How do you like them relative to their ownership? Does it seem to be neutral to, overweight, or underweight?
So they are getting ownership here. They have about a 5% top stack percentage. Individually looking at what they're pulling, it's Mookie Betts at his broken $4,400 price tag pulling 17%. Turner and Muncy both pulling 10 to 11. Smith's around 10. I think the ownership is about where it should be. Again, Mookie Betts just stands out as a phenomenal option. He is an outfielder, so it's still a case where while he is wildly, wildly underpriced, you can always get away from him in tournaments just because there's going to be a million options. I'd be very surprised, though, if $4,400 Mookie Betts isn't showing up in cash lineups on DraftKings. So, I mean, I like the Dodgers here, but I do respect Marquez as a pitcher. You're getting him outside of Coors Field. His WOBA outside of Coors is 100 points lower than at home this year. He's a talented enough pitcher. So I like the Dodgers, but I just don't really think that it's another situation where, like, why are they pulling more ownership than Houston? Like, the Dodgers are expensive. Houston's expensive. If everybody's going to go to the Dodgers, I'm going to Houston. I think that there's a lot of teams that are just pulling less ownership than the Dodgers that I like just as much, really.
Yeah, I think they're a reasonable team to get to. I'll probably ultimately be a little bit underweight to them just because there's so many teams I like at low ownership today. And it seems like we recommend a lot of offenses today because there's a lot of offenses to like. If you're playing 150 lineups, I think this is a slate to be spread pretty thin. There's just not one spot that really stands out above all the rest. But we'll see what changes later on in the day. We've got stuff like weather concerns, only 1 run of ownership. I expect some of that to change later on in the day. So one final time, guys, please like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, we'll be back later on the day for deep dive and live before lock. So good luck today and hope to see you later.